Can you read it once, absorb it, and get on with it? That's a common complaint I hear, that people actually have to read something a couple of times before they get the message. If that's happening, then you're not doing your clients or yourselves any favors.
You're listening to the Legal Mastermind Podcast with your hosts Ryan Klein and Chase Williams, the go-to podcast for learning from the experts in the legal community about effective ways to grow and manage your law firm.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Legal Mastermind Podcast. This is your co-host, Ryan Klein, and I have with me Chase Williams. What's up, Chase?
Hey, Ryan. I'm so excited to talk about communication today.
I am too. Communication is the core of many business transactions and relationships, and that's why we have Charlotte Davis. Charlotte Davis is the founder of Verve Communications. She has over 20 years experience in strategic communications leadership roles in both the private and not-for-profit sectors. How's it going, Charlotte? Nice to have you on.
Yeah, I'm well, and thank you very much for inviting me to be on your podcast.
Absolutely. So today we're going to be discussing a lot about clarity, especially in the legal industry where a lot of jargon can come between clients and lawyers quite often. And Charlotte, you have quite a bit of experience developing lawyers in the way that they communicate so they use as plain of language as possible.
Yeah, that's right. I guess maybe I should give you a little bit of my background. I have an English degree to begin with, and then a law degree, and I practiced law for almost 8 years in Toronto. And then I transitioned into marketing and communications, first of all in the not-for-profit world, but then in legal, and then also with other professionals. I worked for 5 years with an engineering company. So now for the last 4 years, I've run my own business advising professionals, lawyers, engineers, architects, and other professional consultants on how to communicate effectively so they get their message across, so people understand it, so people remember it. And then ultimately that's all tied to business development as well, which is the name of the game.
So Charlotte, one of the biggest things that I know that we really want to focus on are debunking some myths around content. We get really close to what we're talking about when we're working on every day. So as being an expert and a professional in your industry, whether you're a lawyer or a marketer or whatever you're doing, you get really close to the jargon. And naturally, I think you want to sound smart. You want to sound like you know what you're talking about and almost have that expert voice. But I know before the call, we were talking, especially like doing like B2B. What's the myth surrounding that whole theory?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, lawyers work with words. Words are their tools. But unfortunately, it doesn't mean that they're always the best at communicating. And that's understandable. Brian Garner, who's a well-known author and plain language advocate in the US, he says there's 3 main reasons why it's hard to write clearly. First of all, writing isn't easy in general. Most people don't do it well. That's including very well-educated people. So lawyers are no different. Then lawyers get the added burden of they've been steeped in historic documents and court decisions that use jargon and specialized expression instead of everyday words. And that kind of writing is not particularly engaging. It tends to be pretty formal, bordering on pompous, tedious. So that's what they're reading. That's what they're trained to read. And then they end up producing writing that mimics that. It's pretty wordy. It's pretty heavy. It sounds artificial. And then the whole system perpetuates itself. So lawyers get trained like that in law school. Then they go to a law firm and they're trained by other lawyers who have also learned that way. And then they're using precedents, and this all becomes really ingrained. So that's kind of my empathy and my understanding of why this happens. But just to then address your question about the myths. So I think that over time, lawyers think they have to write that way because that's what seems lawyer-like, and that's what makes them seem like an expert. They think that good legal writing is complex. It's not simple. It needs to be full of gravitas. They think that their clients expect that. They think that judges expect that. And a big one is they're afraid of making a mistake and not covering all the bases. So that's when you get those crazy, complex sentences in a contract that seems to cover everything but the kitchen sink, and maybe the kitchen sink, but in the end, no one really understands what it's covering. And also, short, concise, clear communication actually takes more time to create. There's that old quote. We sometimes hear it's attributed to Mark Twain or Benjamin Franklin, but it's actually the French philosopher and writer Blaise Pascal. If I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. So those are the sort of the myths that surround the lawyers thinking why they need to write in plain language. But the research tells us that actually people want, including business people who are sophisticated, want clear, short, concise information that makes sense to them and that actually ties to their business and their business objectives.
I love that quote.
Yes.
It's a good one. And I think that does come into play quite a bit here. So when you're talking about this actual content that they're writing, you're talking about how they approach client correspondence. You're talking about how they convey their own brand and their own, bio on their website. What are some examples of a lawyer probably needing to put an emphasis on simple writing in different mediums or in different situations?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I understand your question.
Well, so, like if a lawyer is writing correspondence, sometimes they should consider not using so much jargon when they're trying to get their point across to a client or to another law firm. But then, like in our situation, sometimes lawyers want to write content for their own websites to convey their knowledge or help people understand their services. So I think I'm just trying to kind of like confirm all the times that they would apply the more simple language to,
Okay. Yeah, so I would say apart from, say, a factum, I won't even say that. So the idea of writing in plain language, clear language, would go across the board. So whether a lawyer is writing an email, and so much of the communication to clients these days is by email, whether they're writing an email or a letter that might end up in the mail, or their own bio for a conference or a speaking engagement, or their website, the same principles apply. You still have to think first and foremost about your reader. Who is your reader? And you have to try and picture that person or people. What is it that they need to know? How is it that you want them to think of you? So that's something you need to think about, is when you're thinking about the tone. So there's a great little format that Josh Burnoff, who's a writer and a writer, he has a great book called Writing Without Bullshit. He has a little structure which he calls the ROAM analysis. That's ROAM, and ROAM is for reader. You think about your reader. O is the objective. What is it that I'm trying to communicate here? A is for action. What kind of action do I want them to take? It might be, I need them to approve this settlement, or I need them to give me instructions, or I want someone to click further into my website, or I want them just to remember me and think about me the next time they need an attorney. And then M is kind of a impression, which is, how do I want this person to think of me? And it may seem kind of basic, but when you're writing, I think it's important to think, okay, I need them to think of me as helpful, knowledgeable, responsive. I speak in plain language because I want them to understand. So whenever you're writing anything at all, I think that kind of ROAM analysis is really helpful. And sometimes it seems like an exercise, but it's good to keep in mind. So there's, I think, no place, I would argue, and I think the research and the national and international clarity organizations, there are organizations that devote themselves to this, they all would say, no matter what you're doing, even if it's a submission to a judge, it should be written with plain language and clear language. And it tends to be way more forceful and direct and more interesting to read than the long, convoluted sentences that by the time you get to the end, you have to kind of go back and go, what the hell are we talking about here? So I would say it applies across the board.
So as small wins go, I know some people like to write in passive voice. Some people like to write in active voice. What are best practices there?
Well, I'm a big fan of the active voice, but I think the passive voice is one that's used by lawyers a lot and other consultants, I guess I would say, because the people often write things like an investigation was undertaken, or a research project was commenced. So I don't want to do like a whole grammar 101, but I think probably your readers or your listeners know passive voice is where the object of the sentence starts acting like a subject. So in a normal simple sentence, we have a subject and we have a verb. So the subject is the actor and the verb is the action and the subject is doing something. So rather than an investigation was commenced, we don't know who commenced that investigation, and it makes the investigation the subject of the sentence. Instead, when we talk about the active voice, we advocate that you say, our law firm commenced an investigation. So now we have a subject, an actor, and they're doing something. And it avoids ambiguity because we know who's actually doing the action. It is shorter and it is more forceful. So a couple of maybe simple examples, like passive would be the contract was amended by the employer. Now, a lawyer might write that, say, in a brief or a submission to a court. That's 7 words. That's passive. The contract was amended by the employer. And then you can usually tell when you're into passive when you've got the was, and then you've got a verb, and then it's by somebody. So whenever you see the was amended by, you know you're in the passive. But the active would be the employer amended the contract. So in that case, it's only 2 words difference, but we're clear. We know who the actor was. We know what they did. They amended the contract. But in other cases, you can actually reduce the word count by quite a lot. And it just keeps it, it's clearer. We know who's doing the action. It's shorter and it's more forceful. So that's one of the things, part of my work is working with law firms when they're writing articles for clients. And I'm constantly correcting the passive and active and kind of on my soapbox about that. But that would be something that alone, if lawyers could really be attuned to when they're using the passive voice, and most times, 9 times out of 10, their writing would be clear if they got rid of it. There are some exceptions. Let's say you're talking about a piece of legislation and it was amended. Well, it's not so important that we know who exactly amended that legislation. It probably went through quite a process and there was different levels of government maybe involved. So in that case, it's not important that we know who did it, and the passive is okay there. But generally, get rid of the passive. It just makes your writing kind of weak and unclear. And that's what we're trying to get, is clear, forceful language.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent example to illuminate something that may seem kind of straightforward, but I guarantee a lot of people don't think about it. And that kind of adjustment, I mean, it tightens up content. It makes your messaging shorter and more clear. And, this is all about clarity. And so I can definitely consider this already a resource for lawyers to benefit from. But considering resources and your background, I'm sure that you can offer plenty of other resources right off the bat that can get people on track, or lawyers on track, for following more guidelines for clarity or clarification.
Absolutely. There's a number of good books that people could look into. In the US, I mentioned Brian Garner at the top of the podcast. He's got a number of books, one of which is Legal Writing in Plain English. In the UK, two authors, Mark Adler and Daphne Perry, have written a fantastic little book called Clarity for Lawyers. The UK government website has a great little section on what they call content design. They are advising people in their own organization on how to write content so that it's clear for the users of the UK website. And in the course of doing that, they've got a whole list of ways to be clear and concise. And I mentioned Josh Burnoff. His book is excellent, Writing Without Bullshit. And his, sorry, I don't know if I can swear on your podcast. I don't know. You might want
just the title of the book, you know.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. Okay.
it's you're not saying it just because it's actually what it's.
Yeah.
It's
And
published there.
his website is called withoutbullshit.com. And he has a lot of great resources on just simple things you can do to improve the way you write so that it's clear. And I mentioned the Rome analysis that's on his website and in his book. There are also organizations. I'm passionate about this, but it's certainly not me alone. Clarity International, which is an international organization that promotes plain language. They've got 650 members in 50 countries. They put on an annual conference. They've got resources on their website, and they're actually working towards an objective, measurable, universal multi-language standard for plain language that'll be an ISO standard. In fact, I just got yesterday an email from them asking me to provide feedback on how to make certain things clearer and what I would see as a guiding principle in some of those areas. They sent that out broadly, not just to me, but that your listeners could even just go on their website and see and become a member. It doesn't cost a lot to become a member. There's also the Plain Language Association International, Plain, and that they work often in tandem with Clarity. The US has the Center for Plain Language, which is focused mainly on helping government agencies and businesses write clearly so their audience understands, but those principles that they espouse would be applicable to anybody. And they advocated for the passage of the Plain Writing Act back in 2010. So there's a ton of resources. I guess I would say there's no excuse for not tapping into some of these things and starting to make some changes. You don't have to take it all on board, but even a few changes will help people write clearer and have their audiences understand and like their writing a lot better.
One of the things to really reiterate that it's all got to sort of come back around is that plain English really doesn't mean that we're dumbing down what someone's trying to say. And I know that you put together some really simple steps that lawyers could take to make a change. Do you want to go over some of those steps?
Absolutely. I will just reiterate that you're absolutely right that plain English does not mean dumbed down. It means you need to embrace simplicity without oversimplifying something. And in ways to do that, I would say we just talked about checking out these Clarity organizations. So become a member of one of them, become a member of Clarity or one of the other plain language associations, and check out the resources of those various books. Getting rid of the passive voice that we talked about. Shortening your sentences. This is a really big one. Again, there's research on this that the optimal readability for people of all levels, doesn't matter how educated you are, is an average of 15 to 20 words per sentence. So we know we all have those online checkers. You can actually plug in a sentence and see how many words it is. And I'm sometimes faced with editing clients' work. They've got 45 words in a sentence. Now, I'm telling you, by the end of 45 words, you just lost the plot. So it doesn't mean that every sentence should be 15 to 20 words, but the average of 15 to 20 words is optimal. The other thing that lawyers can do is shorten the paragraphs. Lots of shorter paragraphs just makes the writing more approachable, and this is particularly clear so on online. There we're really scanning and grabbing information, and there isn't any kind of appetite for a big, huge chunk of text. So go ahead, break up those paragraphs, insert headings so you're giving people signposts as to what's going on. We've been talking about language, but the layout and the presentation is also a big aspect of clarity and readability. So the shorter sentences, the shorter paragraphs, the headings all contribute to making a piece of writing approachable and readable. The other thing I would say is get the main message up front. I once read an article from an ex-military guy who now was working in consulting somewhere, I can't remember. And he said in the military, they had something called the BLUF, B-L-U-F, bottom line up front, which always was about, this is the objective, this is what the bottom line is. And then after you stated the bottom line, you filled in all the details. And it's kind of like an executive summary. And we know that busy executives go to the executive summary. They want to know what's the bottom line, what are the key things. And then if they have time and inclination, they're going to read the rest of the document. So in anything, especially online, you've got to put the main message up front and then fill in the details and the rationale and the why. That's really important. And I mentioned too, well, maybe I mentioned this when we were talking before the call, ask the clients to give you feedback. Like, don't be afraid to ask them. So we're auditing all of our communications. How do you find our writing? Is it too long? Is it too short? Do you get the message clearly? Do you have to read it more than once? Or can you read it once, absorb it, and get on with it? That's a common complaint I hear, that people actually have to read something a couple of times before they get the message. If that's happening, then you're not doing your clients or yourselves any favors. So I would say, don't be afraid to go out and say, we're doing a little audit. Can you give us a bit of feedback on how we're doing and how we can make it better? And maybe a client will say, I love what you're doing. Sure, give me 10 pages and put the answer at the bottom. That'll be great for me, but probably not. Right? So.
Yeah, thanks for those. We love the podcast when we can have actionable takeaways, right away, especially if they're quantifiable, like exactly like best practices for the length of a sentence and what to do with paragraphs. So that's certainly great stuff. One thing I definitely want to mention, I was thinking about this about halfway through the podcast, was specifically the author Malcolm Gladwell and his books. I love Tipping Point and Outliers. And one really interesting thing about him is he mentions, I think specifically in his books, I am writing at a 5th grade reading level. He says it, like, it's very clear that's how he's writing. And when I read it, I think the information is fantastic. He is a very well-known and beloved author of very interesting non-fictional subjects. And people don't perceive him as anything less than a very intelligent person who claims very, very overtly, I'm writing at a low level. And the takeaways and digesting the content is great. I can remember, the topics much more from his books as opposed to other business books or nonfiction. So that's at a 5th grade reading level. Would you kind of quantify for legal any sort of reading level at all, and that you feel is it kind of appropriate to kind of give lawyers an idea, or is that appropriate, you think?
I don't know. I mean, I think anywhere from 5th grade level to grade 8 level is usually understandable for the vast majority of people. I think you do have to be sensitive to your audience. So that's where that Rome analysis comes in, the reader being the very first point of that analysis. You have to be thinking, this person is busy. I need to respect their time. How do I communicate this clearly, succinctly, so they get the message, they appreciate my advice, they appreciate what I'm saying, but don't feel mired in muck, I guess, or that I really dumbed down to them. So it's a little bit of a balancing. I'm not sure that there's a hard and fast rule on that. But I think if you write something and give it to someone else and they understand it and they get it the first time, then I think you've succeeded. And I also echo your appreciation and admiration for Malcolm Gladwell and love his podcasts as well. Another person that I think is really interesting, I don't know if you guys know the book Sapiens, and the name of the author is completely escaping me, but it's a very complicated look at the history of mankind. And his writing is so simple and clear, but it is so amazing. And as I was reading that book, I was not only enthralled by what he was saying, and I don't actually read that much nonfiction, but I just thought this is a great way for someone to get how effective it is to write in short sentences that are powerful. And that book is very complicated, and there's nothing dumbed down about that. And you think this guy's got a brilliant mind. So that's another, I guess, tip, is to seek out good writing and read it and then see what kind of effect it has on you, and then say, okay, now why would I go and write these long sentences starting with notwithstanding that the following objects may or may not be present, it is advisable that you do blah, blah, blah. Like, that is just putting people to sleep, and it's not clear. So there's a great, I think, another exercise, which is just read good writing and then think about why it is good and then mimic that.
Yeah, I just wanted to reaffirm that, at the tail end, that these are obviously very educated, intelligent people that write that way for a reason. And I want lawyers to consider that, if anything else.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So they don't need to fear, lawyers don't need to fear that they will not, I think that brings us right back to the beginning. They don't need to fear that they won't be considered intelligent or be taken seriously if they just write clearly.
And Charlotte, if a lawyer's or someone's looking to hire you to help them, what's that process look like from start to finish?
Well, they can just get in touch with me through my website, and usually we would have a conversation about what it is they're looking for. I do a combination of writing from bullet points for people, editing what they've done, to coaching people on their writing, and running workshops as well. So if there's a team of people that they want to start implementing some of these things, that we can do a workshop and then follow up with coaching, or maybe it's just one person in particular who needs the coaching. And the way I work with people varies depending on how comfortable they are with the starting of the writing, whether they just want me to edit and they want to learn from how it is that I edit, or maybe they want me to write the piece and learn from that. So it does depend on the client and what they're looking for, and how much of this they've already done, let's say.
Awesome. And what's the best way to reach you?
I guess they could just email me, which is Charlotte at vervecoms, vervecoms.ca.
Awesome. And Ryan, I think this has been a very successful first interview with a native Canadian. So we're
Yep. I completely agree. I very much enjoyed it. And I think that our listeners will definitely have a lot of takeaways and look inward a little bit more about how clear they are when they're conducting their emails and adding content to their website, and far more things that they do day to day.
Well, thanks very much for having me, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Legal Mastermind podcast. If you're interested in working with Ryan and Chase, please email mastermind@marketmymarket.com. Make sure to join the free mastermind group for growing and managing your firm at lawfirmmastermind.com. Ryan Klein and Chase Williams are the managing partners at Market My Market, one of the top legal marketing companies in the United States.